The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. What is the greatest threat facing the United States, Britain, and Israel today? It would be tempting to look for the answer to that question by looking beyond our borders, given the looming threats from abroad. And those threats are real, and they are intensifying. But the greatest danger facing our people today actually comes from within. Today on the Trumpet Daily, we bring you another new segment recently taped for my father's weekly program, The Key of David. It's titled A House Divided.
Greetings, everyone. What is the biggest danger facing America, Britain, and the Jewish nation in the Middle East? These are the three main countries that are fighting against terrorism. Is their biggest danger radical Islam? Or is it Russia? Or is it China, or is it Europe? Actually, it's none of the above, and it's something that's far more sinister and much more deadly than even those enemies of these countries in many cases. It's one of the, well, I have an example here I'll just show you, but it's certainly a classic example that I'll give you from Jerusalem, and something that's happening in Jerusalem that is also happening to America and Britain, and it is the gravest danger that all three of these nations face, and it's not radical Islam, or it's not some other nation like China or Russia or perhaps somebody in Europe. It's not that at all. I want to read to you an article, just an excerpt from an article by Caroline Glick. This is from carolineglick.com. I think Caroline Glick is one of the outstanding journalists in Jerusalem, and she writes for the Jerusalem Post, and this, I believe, is one of the most sobering articles I have read in months. And I think it should be alarming to a lot of people, and we should begin to look for this gravest of all dangers in America and Britain, and in Jerusalem, of course. Here is what Carolyn Glick wrote on July 5th, 2011. She said, on Monday, saboteurs bombed the Egyptian gas pipeline to Israel for the third time since former President Hosni Mubarak was overthrown in February. Now that, again, you can see that's just another sign, that bombing of that pipeline, that the Muslim Brotherhood is getting the upper hand in Egypt. And you can see our articles that we write about that daily and weekly. And we prove all of that to you, and we prove to you what is happening in Egypt and in the Middle East. But Carolyn Glick went on to write, the move was just another reminder that Israel today faces the most daunting and complex threat spectrum it has ever seen. I mean, this is the worst that they've ever seen. And it's the same problem that America faces as well as their gravest danger. She goes on to write, from Egypt to Turkey to Iran to the international left to the Obama administration, Israel faces a mix of military and political challenges that threaten its very existence on multiple levels. That is, on many levels, its own existence is threatened. You would have to say, well, this must be pretty serious. What is the problem? She goes on to write, to meet these challenges, it is vital for the government and people of Israel to stand strong, unified, and determined. The approaching storm will test our resilience as we have never been tested before. This is the biggest test they've ever had. And it's also the biggest test that America and Britain have. She goes on to say, unfortunately, even if the government is competent and even if the nation stands strong, there is reason to fear that Israel will fail to successfully withstand the dangers gathering against it. Very, very alarming, I'd say. What does it mean? She said, unelected, unrepresentative, and irresponsible senior government officials are liable to take actions that undermine the government's ability to protect the country and weaken the public's morale and unity of purpose. Over the past week, we received 2 reminders of how dire the situation is. The first reminder relates to the institutional impediments to the government's freedom of action in preventing Iran from fielding a nuclear arsenal. Now notice this, and notice what's happening in that country that is so alarming. Since the beginning of his first term as prime minister 15 years ago, Benjamin Netanyahu has consistently warned that the greatest dangers Israel faces stem from the forces of global jihad generally and the Iranian regime and its nuclear program specifically. After taking office for the second time in 2009, Netanyahu made blocking Iran's rise to nuclear power his top priority. He ordered the heads of Mossad and the IDF, or the Israeli Defense Force, to prepare plans to attack Iran's nuclear installations. So he told these 2 top officials in those 2 departments to prepare for an attack against Iran's nuclear facilities. And those 2 leaders just flatly refused to do so. And then they started trying to cause serious problems, according to Carolyn Glick, and forged a document which was actually did happen, and committed some other crimes against the government, and kept all of it from the public in many ways. And it was hard for the public to understand it, but they just flatly refused to do what the prime minister said to do. And so far, the prime minister hasn't been able to do anything about it. Now, that poses a real problem, and there is a problem there that you and I need to understand what it all means, because it is happening in America and Britain as well. The same problem. The same gravest danger of all is happening to America as well, and most of it is done, as she said, by unelected officials. She goes on to say it is impossible for the public to know what is going on behind closed doors. But then she goes on to talk about how, nevertheless, the government is being undermined, and they so far have not been able to do much about it. She concludes by saying, we have reached the point where, due to the subversion of senior officials, our elected leaders are denied the ability to perform their primary function of defending the country. This state of affairs has simply got to end. The government and the Knesset need to put a stop to it. At the end of the day, the Ayatollahs, the sheikhs, the UN, and the anarchists are not our greatest challenge. Our leaders and our people can stand up to them. Our greatest challenge is to stand up to unelected officials who have taken it upon themselves to discredit the cause of victory, embrace weakness, and destroy our sense of national purpose. Now, those are strong, strong words, and this goes far beyond politics. Far beyond politics, and it is really the type thing that leads right into a civil war. And she says that this is their gravest challenge of all, their greatest challenge that they face. This is the greatest. And in one of her recent articles, she even ended by asking the people to pray. And that's the first time I'd ever read of any of her articles where she asked the people to do that. And so I would say she's very alarmed about it, and her emotions, whether people realize it or not, her emotions are the very emotions they're going to lead up into a clash in the Middle East that is going to trigger World War III. And that's mentioned in Daniel 11, verses 40 through 45, or 43. And I'll read a little of that to you later if I have time. But I want to show you something that Jesus Christ said about that very problem that is burdening America and Britain and Israel, all three nations. And he also, though, Christ gives a specific solution to that problem. And there is a solution. Notice verse 25 of Matthew chapter 12. And Jesus knew their thoughts and said unto them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. Now, if you have a divided house, it's going to lead to desolation. That means, according to the Thayer's lexicon, to lay waste, to ruin, to reduce to nothing. That's how bad it is. It is that deadly. And if you're divided against yourself, it's going to come to desolation unless something is done. Something has to be done to solve this problem. You see, the gravest danger is not from the enemies without. It's from bitter division from within. That's the real problem. That's worse than all of them. Abraham Lincoln discussed the same problem just before America entered the Civil War. And through his leadership, they just barely did save the Union. And I think most of you know the history of that. I want to give you a quote from Lord Charnwood, who wrote the biography of Abraham Lincoln, and he said this: now, in 1858, having prepared his speech, he read it to Herndon, that is, Lincoln did. Herndon questioned whether the passage on the divided house was politic. And Lincoln said, quote, I would rather be defeated with this expression in my speech and uphold and discuss it before the people than be victorious without it. Now, you see, that is a different attitude than you usually see in politics today in the three nations I've been talking to you about. But Lincoln actually brought about the uniting of his country, but he did it by putting his country first before politics, before his party, or before himself. Now, that is character you don't see in politics today very much at all. And you can see why we're running into such terrible, terrible problems. And he was one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. Many people think the greatest. And he talked about this house divided. And he even got this speech from the Bible. A house divided against itself cannot stand. That's what the title of the speech was. In the same book, it goes on to say, in my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. Lincoln says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. There were other problems, but slavery was certainly one of the big ones. He said, I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect that it will cease to be divided. That it will cease to be divided. That's what Lincoln was working to rid the nation of. It's either going to have to be all together or all against in a serious problem like slavery and other problems that they were facing at that time. He said, we can't be half slave and half free. We can't possibly deal with our problems with that situation in our country.